Is Dr. Sharon Marshall. Dr. Marshall is a professor at Wayne State University School of Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics. She received her medical degree from the University of Missouri at Columbia, completed her residency in pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Michigan, and then her fellowship both at the University of Miami and at the University of Seattle. She has done several research studies and looking at attitudes of adolescents regarding different contraceptive techniques. Today, she's going to present on and give us an update on contraceptives, including medical abortion. Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you, Dr. Smitherman. When we last talked about contraception and abortion this summer, this was before the decision by the Supreme Court. So we didn't know whether Michigan was going to be a state that banned abortion or not. After the November election and the passage of Proposal 3, the status of abortion in Michigan has not changed. So what I thought I would do today is review the history of abortion in the United States, since the majority of us were not practicing medicine when before Roe v. Wade, and then look at what's happening in states that are currently banning or have restrictions on abortion. So I have no financial or commercial disclosures. And our objectives for today are to review the history of abortion in the United States, know or be aware of the current abortion law in Michigan, and review the reproductive health care in states that currently have abortion restrictions or bans. So just to remind you, our typical adolescent patient in these scenarios is probably, there's not going to be much talk about adolescents and abortion just because there's not much data other than the numbers, how many adolescents have abortions or terminate pregnancy. But just to remind you, our typical patients have unintended pregnancy. For example, in case 1, this is a new patient to your practice. She and her mother are there for their annual exam, and the patient has painful menstrual cramps. Mother had the same thing as an adolescent, and her dysmenorrhea was managed with birth control pills. So mother wanted this for her daughter. While you're doing the interview, the medical assistant knocks on the door and informs you that her pregnancy test is positive. So this is not uncommon in adolescent medicine. This is the type of unintended situation that girls find themselves in. The second case is a little bit older, an adolescent who was in college, who'd been your patient for many years. You see her over her scheduled appointment during the Christmas holiday break. A few minutes into the interview, she tearfully says that she was sort of raped. She thinks possibly, maybe she said yes, by an ex-boyfriend. Her last period was 2 months ago, and she did a home pregnancy test as positive, and she's wondering if she's pregnant. So this is the typical case for adolescents. They didn't plan to be pregnant. They didn't use contraception well. They didn't think they would get pregnant. So let's look at the timeline for abortion. These are the highlights that we're going to talk about. The early 1800s are colonial America, right after the Revolutionary War or American War for Independence. The 1873 Comstock Act, which was very important. And then 1931, when Michigan passed an abortion ban. Then 1973, the pivotal Roe v. Wade case. And then 2021, Texas, the Senate Bill 8 we'll talk about. And then the last major decision in 2022, Dobbs versus Jackson. So in early 1800s and prior to that, this is what we're talking about as the United States in green. The rest of this was still British or Spanish or French territory. So at this time, America followed English common law, which said that prior to quickening, so you'll see this in the literature, this is when the mother first feels the fetal movement or baby's movement about 4 months or 6 weeks into gestation. So abortion was commonly done. This was accepted by English common law. It was treated more as a woman's problem and was evidence of sex outside of marriage. That's the way it was viewed, but there was no legal prosecution. So women at that time used various means or methods to induce abortion, including ingestion of toxic chemicals, herbal remedies and teas, the apium family, which are some of the root vegetables. So celery, carrots, and parsley were made into teas, strong diuretics, enemas, laxatives. Sharp objects were inserted into the uterus or the cervix to rupture the membrane, amniotic membranes, dislodge the fetus. So knitting needles, wire clothes hangers, candles, curling iron are some of the things you see in the literature. Then various chemicals could be installed into the vagina. Bleach, turpentine, detergents, motor oil was listed. And then under abdominal pressure. So physically striking the pregnant woman's abdomen, wearing an extremely tight corset or girdle, excessive abdominal massage. And then there were other things, excessive exercise, what was described as controlled rolling down stairs. How you could control that, I don't know. Sitting over a steaming herbal remedies. The woman would sit there unclothed and over hot steaming herbal remedies. Onions were cited to induce uterine contractions. And then soaking in a hot bath with a tub filled with gin were some of the methods that people used. So some of these were successful, some weren't. Initially, what you find is that people were using herbal remedies that they found growing in their area. And if you look at the literature, abortion was practiced in all cultures, all countries where you look for it around the world. So whatever was growing in that area, people who were familiar with botany at that time, women were making teas from what was available. So there was a Canadian advertisement that advertised the use of quinine, ergot of rye, and they stated that this was used by women to put herself right. Enslaved women would commonly make a tea of cotton root bark. And then other things that you see growing wildly, savin, which is some of the juniper species, rue, pennyroyal, sage, and tansy, which is part of the aster flower family. And even Benjamin Franklin published a recipe for an abortifacient tea. An early pharmacy manual called King's American Dispensary in 1898 published instructions how to make a tea of brewer's yeast and pennyroyal. And then as America became more industrialized, you start to see the appearance of what they call patent medicines or over-the-counter medicine, and less use of some of the wildflowers or herbs that were growing. So they had various names, feminine tablets, regulatory pills. Some of these were quite toxic. They may have contained chemicals like iron or lead. Pennyroyal is a perennial wildflower that you see here, and it actually will induce uterine contractions. However, this was a very dangerous medicine because the dose that was required to induce uterine contractions was close to the lethal dose. So all of the ones that are highlighted in yellow here, these have been scientifically proven to induce abortion. So patent medicines or over-the-counter medicines were common. This was one called Lydia Pinkham. And what they will say was a vegetable compound that was a uterine tonic and a uterine sedative, a tonic for men and women, and a sanitative wash for women. So they would claim to cure various ailments, headache, constipation, hemorrhoids, and female problems. this was the Victorian era, so you could not talk about pregnancy. So the labels explicitly stated that the medicine was not to be used by pregnant women as it may cause an abortion. So you had to be able to read between the lines. And this was commonly distributed by mail order or sold in pharmacies. This is an advertisement for medication in London. It was called Reynolds Lightning Pills. The only certain remedy on the market for female, a sure and prompt cure for all irregularities and all complaints incidental to the female system. So none of these will explicitly say that they will induce an abortion. So this continued kind of unregulated. There weren't, government agencies to check to approve medications to make sure they were safe or toxic. That was starting to develop. By the 1850s, you started to see different groups oppose abortion. And on the medical side, the AMA, which was about 10 years old at the time, in 1857, sought to criminalize abortion. Some thought this was because they were facing competition from midwives. And at that time, midwives primarily handled women's delivery and childbirth, and they were doing quite a few abortions. Some of their other concerns were that not all physicians were trained to perform an abortion. And the AMA cited that they didn't think that the quickening, that 6 weeks, it didn't matter whether the pregnancy was terminated at 6 weeks or 16 weeks. They didn't view that as significant. Political opposition, there were groups that were concerned that the elite women, Anglo-Saxon Protestant women, were having fewer children, smaller families, and with increasing numbers of migrants or people immigrating to the country, they had larger numbers of children, larger families, that there would be a decrease in the wealthy population. And then on the religious front, 1869, the Roman Catholic Church banned abortion at all gestations. The government started making an attempt to control what was distributed. And in 1940, the Federal Trade Commission outlawed the sale of all over-the-counter abortifacient medicine. So it was still distributed, but in secret. So early surgical abortion, a paper published in 1870 on abortion services stated that most commonly they would insert a catheter into the uterus and instill water to disrupt the pregnancy. And these, even in medical situations, so in a hospital setting, the death rate was about 30%, leading the AMA to launch their campaign to criminalize abortion because they wanted to have it done by just physicians, not midwives, and just doctors trained to do abortion, which would make sense that you would need training. So, various groups became concerned about abortion and whether this was right or something that should be done. England outlawed abortion after 16 weeks in 1803. In the United States, it was generally allowed before 16 weeks. It was considered a misdemeanor, but very rarely prosecuted unless there was maternal death. Then there may have been charges brought. At the end of the Civil War, there were advances in surgical techniques because of all the battlefield surgeries, advances in anesthesia and aseptic technique and sterilization, which started to make surgical abortion safely. And in 1870, surgical abortion was available in several major cities, including New York, New Orleans in the South, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Chicago, and Indianapolis. At that time, about one abortion was done for every 4 live births in those cities. And what you started to see was legislation, anti-abortion legislation start to appear. So in 1821, Connecticut targeted pharmacies selling abortifacients. So they would send the police out and look for those medications. In 1829, New York made abortion before 16 weeks a misdemeanor, and after 16 weeks a felony. And then Anthony Comstock was the U.S. Postal Inspector, and he was in the Victorian area head of a anti-vice program. He was secretary of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and he wanted to reform the morals of the country. Because he was the postal inspector, he urged Congress to pass a law, which they did, called the Comstock Act of 1873. So this law made it illegal to send obscene, lewd, or lascivious, immoral, or indecent publications through the mail. So this included anything that discussed contraception or abortion. So not only sending it through the mail, but it made it illegal to either produce this material, to make pamphlets, discuss or distribute this information on contraception, abortions, or sexually transmitted infection. And this included for medical students. This was not to be discussed. And it was punishable by fines as well as prison time. By 1910, most of the states had anti-abortion laws, but they were unevenly prosecuted. Sometimes a physician or whoever was involved in the procedure would be prosecuted, not usually the woman herself, but those performing the procedure, and especially if there was a maternal death. So Anne Lohman, her business name was Madame Restell. She was born in England and immigrated to the United States. She had a successful midwifery practice. She was a millionaire several times over by the time she died. And it's not certain whether she was actually trained as a midwife, but she provided confidential services for women, whether they needed an abortion medication. She would do that by mail, or made home visits to do surgical abortions. And she had a wealthy clientele as well as a sliding fee scale for poor women. She was arrested in 1841 for performing surgical abortions. She served jail time, and after this, she only did medication abortions. She was targeted by the press and the AMA for providing abortions, and Anthony Comstock himself actually arrested her in 1878. So he pretended to be a gentleman whose mistress was pregnant, and he purchased medication for an abortion or made arrangements for an abortion. And when Madame Restell made those arrangements, she was arrested. She posted bail, but the next day she committed suicide. So life before abortion was legal, was very different for women. This was done in secret. There was a lot of shame and a lot of ridicule and name calling for women who were pregnant and not married. So steamship travel, air travel allowed wealthy women to travel to other countries where abortion was safe and legal. But the majority of women in this country were faced with dangerous oil preparations or illegal surgical abortions. Hospitals had sepsis wards for women with post-abortion infection, which was not uncommon. And women suspected of having an abortion were interrogated by the police and threatened with jail time. Physicians found guilty of performing abortions could be prosecuted and lose their license. And as late as the 1960s, a Chicago women's advisory group who called themselves Jane, these women became trained in abortion, performing surgical abortions, and they had a floating clinic around the city of Chicago. So it moved from place to place. Women were given a phone number and told to call Jane, and were given instructions on where to go. So at this time, about 1931, Michigan passed one of the most restrictive laws abortion was not allowed if the pregnancy was a result of incest or rape. So many states had this in their legislation, that they would allow it in these cases, but not Michigan. It was only allowed if the mother's life were in danger. And anyone performing an abortion or women who attempted to induce abortion could be punished by jail time. So to give you an idea of what people went through, this was Polly Bergen, who was an actress, who talked about her illegal abortion in 1940. Someone gave me the phone number of a person who did abortions. I borrowed $300. So my roommate went alone to a dirty, rundown bungalow in a dangerous neighborhood. A greasy looking man came to the door, asked for the money. He told me to take off my clothes. There was a towel to wrap myself. I got up on a cold metal kitchen table. He performed a procedure using something sharp. He didn't give me anything for pain. He just did it. He said he had packed me with some gauze. I should expect some cramping. I would be fine. She was infertile after that. And she said that if someone else had not given her antibiotics, she probably would have died. Closer to home, Renee Chilean is the founder of Northland Family Planning Center in Detroit. And her personal story of her abortion at age 15, it was in the Detroit press this summer. Her 16-year-old boyfriend had tried to get condoms. No one would sell him condoms. He tried withdrawal, but Renee got pregnant anyway. She tried to hide her pregnancy, but her family eventually found out. It was decided that she would marry her boyfriend and move out of state, which was something that was commonly done so people would know about their pregnancy. But the boyfriend's father intervened. He paid the equivalent of $22,000 in our current dollars. She didn't even know there was such a procedure called an abortion. She and her father went to a parking lot. They were blindfolded, driven to a warehouse full of women and girls. She was given an anesthetic, but she was further along than anyone knew. She had the procedure, her uterus was packed with gauze, and she was told she would go into labor in a few days, but she did not. Her family doctor referred her to an OBGYN who provided antibiotics as she was quite sick. 7 days later, she went and had another procedure at a different warehouse. A few days later, she did go into labor. She describes it being a very hot day in Detroit summer, and the family had the windows closed to hide her screaming. Her boyfriend's father paid the equivalent of $2,000 to dispose of the evidence. She was told to never discuss this again. And she hadn't discussed this with her family, her parents, but until she published this article, and she did let them know, and they approved of her talking publicly about this. So in the 1960s, more reproductive laws were passed. If you can believe, the Supreme Court struck down a law banning contraception for married couples. 67, Colorado decriminalized abortion for physicians performing abortion in cases of rape, incest, or severe maternal disability. These 4 states were quite progressive and legalized abortion for women in their country. And in 72, the Supreme Court struck down the laws banning distribution of contraception to unmarried couples. And then also, if you remember 1960, the birth control pills was the first first hormonal contraceptive. This came out in 1959. And this was when what was popularly called the Women's Lib movement, or women's rights and advocacy groups, were demanding more access and advocacy for women. And we get to the pivotal case of Roe v. Wade. So in Texas, abortion was only legal to save a woman's life in 1969. Jane Roe was the name given to the woman who was pregnant. She had tried to obtain an illegal abortion, but was unable. And she was put in contact with some lawyers who were really wanting to challenge the the abortion law. Henry Wade was the district attorney who prosecuted the case. Texas court ruled that this violated her right to privacy and went all the way to the Supreme Court, who ruled that it was a right to privacy, and Roe v. Wade was passed. So the death rate for women after abortions plummeted after the passage of Roe v. Wade, as you can see here. So in 1916, this was the state of abortion in the United States. Primarily, 75% identified themselves as poor or low-income women. 62% said they had religious affiliation. 59% already had one child. The majority of them were in their 20s. Majority were white, and then African-American was second. So immediately after Roe v. Wade passed, states began passing laws restricting access to abortion. So one of the more famous cases was the Planned Parenthood of South Pennsylvania versus Casey. And the court allowed that states could impose restrictions on abortion access as long as they did not impose an undue burden. So then there were mandatory 24-hour waiting periods after an appointment was made before the abortion could be performed. Some states adopted that, and then some states adopted mandatory counseling about the procedure. So Michigan has both of those in place. So if you look, this is 2010 to 2022. Over the years, various states were passing more restrictive abortion laws, with the majority of them being enacted in 2021. One of the most powerful laws was passed in Texas, called Texas Senate Bill 8, or SB 8. This was passed in 2021. So often called the Heartbeat Act. It required a physician to determine the presence of a fetal heartbeat. Once a heartbeat was heard, an abortion may not be performed except if it was a medical emergency or life-threatening pregnancy complication. They also enacted a legislation that allowed citizens to sue a medical provider or the woman herself or anyone assisting the woman with an abortion, and they passed a law so that citizens who had filed a successful complaint would be awarded $10,000 as motivation. So this study was published in August of 2022, and they looked at physician and patients' view in Texas, their perceptions, or what it was like to practice medicine or be a patient in Texas at this time. So there were 50 clinicians who were interviewed and 20 women, and these were the clinician views. Some clinicians still provided abortion counseling, but others felt the law limited their ability to discuss abortion, and they no longer would do that with the patient. Some no longer offered standard of care treatment. So ectopic pregnancies where the pregnancy was implanted in a cesarean scar. Prior to Senate Bill 8, this would medical standard care would be to induce the pregnancy and terminate it. Premature rupture of membranes before viability. Some clinicians were saying they now discharge these patients, refer them somewhere else, often stating that they return later with sepsis. Some clinicians will follow current medical guidelines and induce labor and terminate a pregnancy in these situations. So, I mean, as a patient, you don't know how to find a physician you don't know before you get there what your doctor's beliefs are. One physician stated that people have to be on death's door to qualify for maternal exemption to this law. In other cases where the physician deemed that abortion was allowable under Texas law, ancillary staff, so your anesthesiologists, nurses, et cetera, may have been or were often reluctant or declined to participate in that surgical case because they feared they could be prosecuted. Fertility centers whose common procedure was to implant, multiple embryos in the uterus and then do fetal reduction. Many cases, this is no longer being done. And then patients expressed concern about feeling upset and scared, frightened. They were, after being told they had a non-viable baby or a serious maternal condition, and that they could not receive medical treatment in Texas if their physician did not follow standard of care. So either they remained in Texas or they went to another state. And all of the women had medically complex pregnancies that they interviewed. Mothers of babies with things like anencephaly or bilateral renal agenesis. They said they were instructed to continue their pregnancy and their baby would receive supportive care after birth. Many women stated their physician would not discuss termination. And there were numerous examples where women had to wait until they had their pregnancy complications became life-threatening, or they had no longer had a fetal heartbeat before the abortion could be performed. So this was Texas in 2021. In Mississippi this summer, are actually the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization in Mississippi was heard by the Supreme Court, and they ruled 6-3 in favor of the Mississippi law about the constitutionality of abortion after 15 weeks. This now allowed your states to choose whether they would allow pregnancy, restrict, or prohibit abortion. And so each state could make their own decision. So in states that restrict abortion, women who have a miscarriage or stillbirth may be suspected of illegal or self-induced abortion, and they may face criminal investigation. Women who travel to another state for an abortion are going to incur travel costs, lodging costs, increased appointment time, which may make the cost and complexity of the procedure more complicated. If they have complications after returning home, they may have difficulty finding treatment in their state. If their state has abortion restrictions, trying to find a physician to take care of them. Women may be requesting more time off from work for reproductive care. Will your insurance cover a procedure that's out of state if you have insurance that covers abortion? OBGYN trainees will need to travel out of state to have abortion training. And we all know what it's like trying to arrange away rotations for residents. This is another complication. In December, at the end of 2022, the FDA changed the label on norethindrone, which is emergency contraception, but they specifically removed the wording morning after pill, so it could not be confused with mifepristone. And the label now clearly states that it will not induce an abortion because some women have the two medications confused. So this is, as of December 12, 22, this is the state abortion ban policy. So the dark red are the most restrictive laws. This is Michigan here. We have some restrictions, some protections. The most protective are going to be New York and California here. So some additional things, just to add a twist to this. States' bans are very different. So they have different gestational ages. So if you're in a state that bans an abortion and you find out at 6 weeks, maybe you plan to go to Georgia before 6 weeks, but then maybe you don't get the money or travel arrangements and you're further along. So you can't go to Georgia. Now you have to look for another state. 100 days after the Dobbs decision, about 66 clinics, abortion clinics across the United States had closed. In Texas, a judge decided to hand down a ruling about Title X, which is a federal program that funds family planning clinic stating that treating minors without parental consent violates the constitutional right of parents to direct their upbringing of their child. This is a slippery slope, which is very scary because this would seriously change minors' access to confidential care if this was passed widely around the country. Other things in terms of politics, the US Republicans have passed a resolution in the House to condemn attacks on abortion facilities, on anti-abortion facilities, which we should, no one should be attacking any agency, but also to impose penalties on a physician if they refuse to care for an infant born alive after abortion procedure. And then in November 22, voters across the states in California, Michigan, and Vermont approved constitutional protections for abortion rights. So what about HIPAA? Does it provide healthcare agencies or physicians with any protection? This opinion was in JAMA, and they talked about HIPAA and what it does and doesn't do. So it does provide some protection, but it's not absolute. Patients' health records are protected, their personal health information, but just like things may be reported to police agencies, if there's abuse or neglect, there may be court orders that will subpoena records. You may be in a state that has an abortion ban, they may subpoena records. Other hospital documents outside of the patient records. So hospital committee minutes, hospital emails, if you're using or discussing a patient's condition on a hospital email. This is protected by HIPAA, but these records can be subpoenaed looking for evidence that an abortion was performed in a state where there's a ban, or women who traveled out of state. Patients' online searches are not protected by HIPAA, but if you have a patient searching abortion or abortion medication, this could be used to incriminate them. So menstrual period apps, tracking your period apps were very common, and we, for a long time, were promoting this for adolescent girls because they like computers, like their cell phone, and they can never keep track of their periods. But now, you know, if you have a young lady who hasn't had a period for 6 months in a row, in some states, this could be used to determine if she could have had an abortion. So some things have happened around the country supporting reproductive health care. Some states have committed more money to abortion infrastructure. Illinois actually increased funding for Medicaid-funded abortions. New clinics were built. In Maine, they established an 8-foot protective zone around clinic entrances to ensure the safety of clinic staff and patients. And in Colorado and California, those medical boards made it illegal for someone to bring disciplinary action against providers for providing reproductive care or for abortions, just simply because the person or that physician or clinician did an abortion on a patient. Maybe she came from another state where it's legal in Colorado, but the other state, according to the medical boards here, cannot prosecute. Massachusetts passed laws to protect clinicians who are providing gender-affirming care. And California is working on passing laws to protect electronic devices, tablets, cell phones from being used by police or courts to determine if there was evidence of abortion. So some medical complications, it's hard to, there's not much published about complications yet, but this was in the, not much published in the medical literature, but looking in the newspaper in November on the Detroit News, West Virginia has a very strict ban. The summer of 2022, this woman was hospitalized for 2 days with premature rupture of membrane. At 17 weeks, the mother's life was determined not to be in danger at that particular moment. She was discharged from the hospital. She had to find a hospital and that would accept her. She eventually drove to Pittsburgh, where labor was induced and the pregnancy was ended. In Joplin, Missouri, again, a woman had premature rupture of membranes, but she had a fetal heartbeat. The medical records show that the doctor said that Missouri law overruled their medical judgment and they could not provide an abortion or induce labor. After several days, she finally found a hospital in Granite City. She went into labor while driving to Granite City and had the procedure. After her story appeared in the news, the Missouri Health Department launched an investigation into the hospital in Joplin that was involved. The patient said the experience was very traumatic and had a tubal ligation. Some other comments were that doctors in states with bans feel like they have to speak to the hospital attorney before they would treat a woman who may need an abortion, who may be having a miscarriage that they feel should be treated according to medical guidelines, but they are afraid to without discussing it with legal. Community physicians are referring more patients than they normally would to tertiary medical care centers because they don't want the legal issue or them being considered for providing an abortion in a state where it's banned. Pregnant women who are diagnosed with cancer, and that's about 1 in 1,000 women, often must travel to another state to terminate a pregnancy, as their chemotherapy or radiation treatment will often induce an abortion, and this could be construed as against the law in those states. So currently, abortion is legal in Michigan through viability of the fetus. After the fetus is able to live outside of the mother, abortion is legal if done to save the life of the mother. And we're all aware that this past November, Michigan voters approved Proposal 3. So we talked about in Michigan that the law states that you have to receive state-directed counseling, and there has to be a 24-hour waiting period between when you make the appointment and when the procedure can be done. Your insurance may pay for this, but oftentimes women don't know that unless you purchase additional coverage, your insurance won't cover this. For our patients, if they're less than 18, they themselves, as well as a parent, need to sign the consent to terminate a pregnancy, or the teen may petition probate court to terminate the pregnancy without parental consent. So this is called the judicial bypass procedure. The clinics that do abortions will have an attorney on retainer. They will submit all the paperwork, arrange for the teen to speak with the judge. The teen simply has to say that in their own words that they're pregnant, they wish to terminate their pregnancy, and that they understand this will end the life of their child. And then the judge will grant them a court order where they can terminate the pregnancy without involving their parent or guardian. And this occurs very timely, so it does not take weeks. This can happen in a matter of 5 to 7 days. They're still required to have an adult accompany them to the procedure, but it does not need to be a parent or guardian. So surgical abortion in Michigan, we're pretty familiar with this. Vacuum aspiration before 12 weeks, after 13 weeks dilation and evacuation. Medication induced abortion at 16 weeks. And then if it's third trimester abortion, it's a little bit longer. It's a 3-day process. Since 2000, when medication abortion became available, the rates have really increased, so that the majority of abortions in 2020 were done by medical abortions instead of surgical abortions. So mifepristone was approved in $2,000 for a medical abortion. This was very beneficial for areas where they had limited access to surgical abortion. So I believe in the Dakotas, there was one abortion provider for South and North Dakota. And so this provided private, simple, safe, effective method. And during the pandemic, obviously, many clinics were closed. This precluded women getting abortion services. So the FDA allowed telemedicine visits in mail delivery of mifepristone, and this was available in Michigan. Other things have recently changed about mifepristone. It used to be that only registered abortion providers could dispense this, and not all pharmacies, only special pharmacies inside of abortion clinics could dispense this medication. But this changed on January 3rd of this year. So the FDA decided that mifepristone may now be mailed universally to patients, and any pharmacy that completes a special certification process may enroll to dispense mifepristone. Prescribers who prescribe mifepristone need to be trained to provide emergency care in case of maternal hemorrhage. So this study looked at, this is aid access. This is the only agency that provides mifepristone without any medical visits. So I shouldn't say without any, over telemedicine. So this is a nonprofit agency. Women will make an appointment and have a telemedicine visit, and the medication is mailed to them. This study that was published in November, they reviewed the rates of medication requests by state at 3 time points. So September to May, and this was the baseline. So this was prior to the leak of the Supreme Court decision about abortion. They had about 82 requests a day for mifepristone. And then on May 2nd, this was after the leak of the Supreme Court decision from 6/23 to 6/23, they had 137 requests per day for mifepristone. And then after the Hobbs versus Mississippi decision, so on 6/24 through August, they had 213 requests. Over that entire 12 months, there were more than 42,000 requests for mifepristone. So if you look at this, last little graph, this is before the leak, this is after the leak period, and this is after the Hobbs decision. And these are the states with the most restrictive or total bans on abortion. So the majority of your southern states and Idaho are included in here. So a medical abortion can be done up to through 10 weeks or 77 days after the last menstrual period with an ultrasound to date the gestation. Mifepristone is one pill that blocks progesterone, followed by prostaglandin to dilate the cervix. When both medications are used, it's 95 to 98% effective. So there are contraindications: ectopic pregnancy, current IUD use, or if they have a bleeding disorder. So they take mifepristone, they take NSAIDs because they are going to have some pretty severe cramping for the next 2 or 3 days, pass a lot large clots, and have a lot of bleeding. They should make sure that they're hydrated. The prostaglandins will cause a low-grade fever for the first 24 hours. And they may start hormonal birth control immediately, have an IUD inserted, Nexplanon inserted. Efficacy of medical abortion is very good. The earlier it's done, it's more effective. So if you look at less than 8 weeks, 98% effective. By the last week, 10 to 11, 87% effective. So self-managed abortions. Throughout the pandemic, evidence of self-managed abortions are increasing. This is the terminology that's used now in the literature for women inducing abortions without medical supervision. We talked about some of the methods. There are online illegal pharmacies that offer medications to induce abortion. The quality and reliability of the medication is questionable. People are smuggling medications from other countries, other sources. They're cheaper. And especially our adolescents may be vulnerable because they are very comfortable doing things online, and they may do this, and rather than talk with their parent or guardian, are you their medical provider? So in summary, think about your adolescent patients. If you are counseling them if you're their primary care provider, talk about contraception even before they're sexually active, talking about pregnancy prevention. And if they do become pregnant, to come to you, come to another physician, their parents, as a trusted resource for help. And remember that the most vulnerable among us will suffer the most, and be an advocate for kids and adolescents. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. This is very informative and very interesting. Are there any questions from the audience?
Dr. Marshall, this is Chan from St. John. Are there any studies looking at the complications from self-administration, let's say from misoprostol or mifepristone or anything like that?
I didn't see any. I think we're probably going to see more, especially as this is becoming the most common abortion method. The most problematic or one of the biggest problems is excessive bleeding, and trying to get patients to make sure that they follow up with the healthcare provider and that they return for follow-up care. I think with women attaining medication online and maybe traveling to another state, complications, they may not be able to follow up with or provide or find treatment. But primarily it's excessive bleeding. I haven't seen anybody talk about any other complications.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Marshall, I had a quick question, and I'm glad that you brought up Plan B. What is the method of action for Plan B versus the mifepristone?
So Plan B is a high dose of progesterone, and it works at several time points. So it's more than just one mechanism of action. So if a woman hasn't ovulated, it will prevent ovulation. If the woman is already ovulated, it will affect the uterine lining to make it very atrophic. So the embryo is less likely to implant. So once an embryo is already implanted, it will not disrupt the pregnancy. And there have been studies of women who unknowingly took Plan B or norethindrone at that dose and later found out they were pregnant, and there's no risk for maternal or fetal complications. So unlike mifepristone, which blocks progesterone, so progesterone is needed to maintain an early pregnancy. So before there's a placenta established, you need the progesterone. And so mifepristone blocks progesterone.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Dr. Marshall? And if not, thank you very much. Jen Brandt will send out the code for today's session so that you can register for CME credit. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks.